Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlene Margot, and I am founder of the Parent Education Series, a program now brought to you by nonprofit, The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us tonight Jennifer Wallace, who will be talking with you about her wonderful new book, Never Enough: When Achievement Culture Becomes Toxic and What We Can Do About It. This book is now a New York Times bestseller. We could not be more delighted to have Jenny with us tonight.
Thank you all so much. I am so grateful to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining me on a school night. I know, as the mother of three teenagers, how precious after school hours are. And so I'm grateful that you are here. I'm often asked, what made you write a book about achievement culture? And so I think I'll start there. And I will tell you that a few things were happening that led to this book. So in 2019, my oldest son, who's now a senior in high school, applying out to colleges, he was in eighth grade, and it hit me that I only had 4 years left with him living under my roof. And so I wanted to know, where should I be putting my parental energies when it came to my parenting? I wanted him to leave our home with all of the skills and the coping strategies and everything I thought he would need, the tools he would need to make his own way in the world. And so that was one thing that was really on my mind. The second thing that happened in 2019 was the varsity blues scandal. And I wonder if I'm sure everybody remembers that. It was parents on the East Coast and the West Coast who got caught in an illegal bribery scheme to get their kids into highly selective colleges. And it made me think, how did we get to the point where parents were now going to jail to get their kids into college? And I wasn't buying the narrative that, parents just want that logo. They just want that sticker on the back of their car. I felt like I had a hunch that there was something much deeper going on than maybe met the eye. And so that started me down my path. And then, kind of the final thing that led to the book was an article I wrote for the Washington Post in 2019 about how a newly named at-risk group, researchers who study at-risk populations, had found that students attending what they call high achieving schools, those are public and private schools all around the country, where the students generally go off to competitive, four-year colleges, schools that offer AP classes, advanced classes, rich extracurricular offerings. Those schools, kids attending those schools were now officially at risk, meaning they were 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder than the average American teen. And it wasn't just during the high school years that was putting these kids in these competitive environments at risk. Researchers studied them starting in seventh grade and followed them all the way into their 30s. And what they found was that these ways of thinking and these ways of coping, namely with substances, followed these kids throughout their early adult years. Many of the students I met talked about how the pressure to achieve, the pressure to do more and more, that every success led to, if they were good at something, it would change the floor. Now all of a sudden, this was the base that they had to keep achieving over and above. And many of them worked themselves really into the ground during the week, and then talked to me about how they would drink to black out on the weekends, that they felt that was the only way that they could really shut down. So I was hearing all of these stories in researching the book. I wanted to make sure that these high achieving kids weren't just kids on the coasts. I wanted to know, were these pressures being felt everywhere? And so, with the help of a researcher at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, I conducted a first of its kind parenting survey. So I wanted to really get to the roots, to get sort of under the competitive landscape. And the researcher said to me, you have to have at least 1,000 parents so that you could really see patterns of behavior. But within a few days, the survey snowballed and over 6,500 parents had filled it out. And I am so grateful. I'll read you a few of the questions that I asked them. I detail it more in the book, but I'll give you just a taste of some of the questions and some of their answers. So I asked parents how much they agreed or disagreed with statements like, others think that my children's academic success is a reflection of my parenting. 83% of parents either somewhat or strongly agreed with that statement. When I asked them how much they agreed or disagreed with this statement, quote, I feel responsible for my children's achievement and success. 75% of parents somewhat or strongly agreed. And I'll leave you with another question that I asked. I quote, how much did they agree or disagree with this statement? I wish today's childhood was less stressful for my kids. 87% of parents somewhat or strongly agreed. So in researching the book, I wanted to understand why my children's childhood was so different than my own. I have similar values to my parents, but our weekends felt so fractured, shuffling them from activity to activity. Homework took on a much bigger role in family life, often, taking the place of family dinners. And I spoke with historians, I spoke with anthropologists, I spoke with economists and historians, and I detail it a bit in the beginning of the book, how we got here, how we got to this level where the achievement pressure was becoming toxic, as those policy reports noted. And the story that resonated most with me, most strongly, was what I call the economic story. So, when I was growing up in the 70s and the early 80s, life was generally more affordable. Housing was more affordable, healthcare was more affordable, higher education was more affordable, everyday items like food were more affordable. There was slack in the system, meaning that a parent like mine could be relatively assured that even with some setbacks, even with some mistakes, even with some failures, even amongst late bloomers, that most likely I'd be able to replicate my own childhood, if not do even better than my own parents did. I mean, that's the American dream, right? And it's been true of generations that not only can you do as well as your parents, but even better. But modern parents today are facing a very different economic story. They are seeing the first generation, the millennials, who are not doing as well as their own parents did. And whether we are aware of it or not, as parents, we are absorbing the macroeconomic forces of our environment. We are seeing the crush of the middle class. We are seeing steep inequity like it's never seen in our country. We are feeling the hyper competition that has, been ushered in with globalization. And we are absorbing these pressures and becoming, in the words of researchers, social conduits, meaning we are sending these fears and these anxieties down to our kids in the way that we parent. This is not to blame parents. This is the pressures that parents are feeling are bigger than any one family, any one school, and any one community. But it's also not to let us off the hook. So, what I found in my research and what I heard from the parents that I spoke with all around the country, and so at the end of that survey, I asked parents if they'd be willing to be interviewed for the survey. And if so, could they email me? And they could be anonymous or not. And hundreds of parents reached out. And so I spent 4 years traveling the country before COVID, then via Zoom, then traveling again once I was boosted. And I met with parents in Washington State, in Los Angeles, in Northern California, in Maine, in Cleveland, Ohio, in Jackson, Wyoming, in Philadelphia, in New Jersey, in Connecticut. I traveled and I spoke with parents even as far as Alaska. One Alaskan mom that I interviewed said to me that her kids don't know what a traditional Thanksgiving is really like because they've always been away at travel soccer tournaments. So she said they don't even know what it's like to have a traditional family Thanksgiving with your grandparents and cousins around the table. And so, what I have found in speaking with these parents all over the country is whether they are aware of it or not, we are betting big that early childhood success, that getting our kids into a quote unquote good college, we hope will act as a kind of life vest in a sea of economic uncertainty. It's always been the job of a parent to prepare our kids to thrive when we are no longer around to guide them. But never has the future felt so uncertain. Parents are sensing fewer and fewer safety nets and fewer guarantees for their kids. We don't know what something like half of the jobs will be when they're out of college. The parents are absorbing these pressures, as I mentioned, these macroeconomic forces, and it is coming out in our parenting. And unfortunately, the very life vest that we are hoping to protect our kids with, that life vest of a good college and achievement, is unfortunately acting like a lead vest for too many kids and drowning too many of the kids that we are trying so desperately to protect. And what I found in my research is that there is a better way. I went in search of the healthy strivers. I wanted to know who were the kids who were doing well despite the pressures in their environment. I wanted to know what was home life like for them? What did their parents focus on at home? What were their friendships like? What was school like? And with the help of another researcher at Baylor, I came across about 14 or 15 things that these healthy strivers, as I call them, had in common. And I outline it all in the book, kind of the commonalities that they had. But really, it boils down to this idea of mattering. These kids I met had a high level of what researchers call mattering. That is, they felt valued for who they were deep at their core by their family, by their friends, and by their larger community. And they were, importantly, they were depended on to add meaningful value back to their families, to their friends, and to their communities. This high level of mattering, it didn't mean that these healthy strivers didn't have setbacks. They were sometimes anxious. They occasionally got depressed. They had negative emotions. They were frustrated. But what mattering did is that it acted like a kind of protective shield. It, it made them resilient. It acted like a buoy that lifted them up. It helped them to bounce back faster. The kids I met who seemed to be really struggling the most were either kids who felt like their mattering was really contingent on their performance, meaning they only mattered when they got the good grades, when they made the A team, when they got into a good college. But surprisingly, the other group of kids who were also not doing as well were kids who felt like they mattered to their parents. They felt valued and significant at home, but they were never depended on or relied on to add value back to anyone other than themselves. And so, what these kids lacked was what I call social proof that they mattered. They heard it in their words, but they didn't see it in action. They didn't actually know that they had the ability to make a positive impact on anyone other than themselves. And so, what it fostered in them was a very narrow, self focused lens. And what happens is when our kids are too self focused, or when adults are too self focused, it really sets them up to be very focused on every failure and every success. Their sense of self is really entangled with their achievements and their failures. So and we're about to go with Charlene and get some Q&As, but what I want to tell parents before we go into the Q&As is that this book is not anti-achievement. I am a high achiever. My husband is a high achiever. I get a lot of joy from my achievements. My husband does too, and I want my kids to achieve. I want them to achieve in healthy ways. I want them to achieve in ways that does not cost them their sense of self and their mental health and their relationships. So what I say at home is that I want my kids to be ambitious for more than just their achievements. Like me, I want them to be ambitious for their marriage, for their friendships, for their hobbies. I want them to be ambitious about cultivating joy in their life and deep, meaningful relationships. And I think what we as parents can do, the best things we can do in our home to help our kids, to protect our kids, is to make sure that definition that we are flashing before them of what a successful life looks like. We need to be deliberate. We can't just model it. We need to be explicit. When our kids are getting pressure from everywhere, when they're getting pressure from their peers in the classroom, from their peers' parents, from the messages on social media, from the messages in their environment, that only certain people matter, those with the good grades, those with the brand name college, those with the, big house, that sets our kids up for a difficult life. And I was going to stop, but I want to give you one more thing that I found fascinating in the research. So I didn't know this before I researched this book, but we are all born universally with roughly a dozen core values inside of us that researchers have studied all over the world. And they break them up roughly into two groups: intrinsic values and extrinsic values. So extrinsic values would be wanting a big house, wanting a status-y kind of job, wanting the brand name college for the brand name. Those are extrinsic goals. Those are things that we're doing to sort of signal our status. Then there are other values that we also have inside all of us, and those are intrinsic values. Intrinsic values are things like wanting to be a good neighbor, wanting to be a contributing member to society, wanting to be good to the environment. So those are intrinsic values. And it's not that the parents I met in these high achieving communities didn't have good values. It's that too often their extrinsic values were activated by the environment they were living in. And it's the same thing that happens to our kids. When we send them to a school, when we raise them in an environment, frankly, like I am on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, they are bombarded day in and day out with extrinsic values. And the reason this is important is because there is very solid research that links extrinsic values to negative mental health and substance abuse disorder. Whereas, excuse me, intrinsic values are linked with really what we want for our kids: well-being, deep, meaningful relationships. So what the researcher Tim Castor advised me is that if you are going to raise your kids to go to these high achieving schools in these environments, that our job as parents is to level up the seesaw, because values operate like a seesaw. And so the more that our kids are exposed to extrinsic values, the more we need to press at home and focus on the intrinsic ones. It's not about having one 20-minute lecture once a year. It's about having, day in and day out, small 1-minute conversations about values explicitly. Why is it that you want to go to a brand name school? What do you hope to get from that? Why is it that you want another pair of name brand expensive sneakers? What are you hoping to get? Are you hoping to get acceptance from your friends? What do you hope comes from that? Because the researchers who study values say this I found fascinating. More than one study found this, that people tend to be materialistic not because they don't value relationships, but because they hope that by pursuing those materialistic values, that they will win the love and the affection that they so crave in their relationships. So what we want to give our kids is this firm sense of mattering for who they intrinsically are. And so now I'm going to let Charlene take over, and I'm sure we will dig into how we can do this in our homes and in our schools.
Well, thank you, Jenny. That was really profound. I just love your statement that we need to level up the value seesaw. Do we ever? So, I have been in this business in education a long time, starting at Stanford at the laboratory preschool for the psychology department. What you're saying sounds profoundly fresh. At the same time, I was at a school in 1981 when David Elkind published The Hurried Child. So we have been talking about this pressure achievement culture for decades. Why do you think things are continuing to ramp up?
I think things are ramping up because our economy is getting worse. I think things are ramping up because parents are feeling the pressures of the environment, the crush of the middle class. They are seeing this widening divide, and they want their kids on the right side of the divide. So I do not blame parents for this. We, I don't want to say that we don't play a role. We play an important role in protecting our kids from these larger forces. But I think that what we haven't talked about explicitly is how our environment, how our economics impact our individual choices as parents. And I think it's time to stop blaming parents. This is not a psychological issue that parents have. This is a sociological issue. It is time to zoom out, give parents context for why they are parenting so intensely, and then to give them frameworks and tools for buffering against that in their own lives and in the lives of their children.
So you think this is related to the scarcity mentality, right? The same thing that drives the competition in college admission. There's only a few good schools. I've got to get my kid into one of them.
I do, but you know what? It wasn't just that I wanted to get my kids into a highly selective college. The parents, a lot of the parents I met, solidly middle class, told me that they could barely afford state college for their kids. So the pressure they were feeling was affording college for multiple children. I mean, this was the pressure. It was not, yes, there were a group of parents who went to these highly selective colleges themselves. And so felt like in their heads, they weren't able to necessarily articulate it, but it felt a bit like a drop in status for their kids not to be able to replicate that same college. And so, we are tasked just by evolution to what sociologists call status safeguard, which is to make sure that our kids, that their status is intact. And so that is really the work of intensive parenting. It is not necessarily that we want to live our lives through our kids. I'm sure that's true in some examples, but really what I saw on the ground and what I read in the research is that parents, particularly mothers, feel tasked with creating safety nets, knitting those safety nets for each one of their children. We live in a country that does not give social support to people. So it is the mother feels like she is tasked with creating those long-term safety nets for her kids.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Jenny. I think that it's really important, parents, to understand that she's talking about something that's happening nationwide. It's not reserved for people who are high income. It's a lesson for everyone, right? That this is not, you're not talking to just one audience. I think that's a really important point.
So the parents that I interviewed came from all socioeconomic groups. Many of them were part of what economists call the favored fifth, which is the top 20 to 25% of household incomes. So just to put that in dollars, like roughly 130,000 a year for a combined family income. This is not a book that is speaking to the 1%. This is not a book that is speaking to the top 10%. because this is speaking to all parents, because what these favored fifth parents do is they set new standards, which trickle down. The standard for success, the standard for getting into that state school, um, trickles down to people who are not, further widening the divide. So this is an issue that is not just, like you said, for the top 25% of earners in our country. This is an issue that is affecting everyone.
Absolutely. We are based here in Silicon Valley, Jenny, and I am a Palo Alton born and raised, so no stranger to this kind of pressure. But when Madeline Levine published her book, The Price of Privilege in 2006, she said, it's not just Stanford, it's not just the West Coast, it's not just the East Coast. We're seeing this all across the country. I'll bet you found that too.
Yes, and I found the research that backs up. So Madeline Levine, right, was speaking as a clinician.
Yeah.
And what these two policy reports that I wrote about in 2019 and subsequent reports have found is that these are pressures that are found everywhere. It is not just in a few pockets, affluent pockets in this country. It is a pressure that may be magnified more in these communities where what I write about it in the book, this idea that I've termed the encore effect, which is the idea that kids feel burdened to, you want to replicate, whether you're aware of it or not, you want to replicate your own childhood for your kids. If you're not able to do that, it feels like you're not as successful as your parents. I I spoke with one mother who had a son in 8th grade, and he said to his mother when she was tucking him in, he said, if I want to be an architect, where could I live? And she said, you could live everywhere. We need architects everywhere in this country. And they were living in Manhattan. And he said, I Zillowed how much our apartment is. I go to private school. I know from the website how much money it is a year. And I Googled up the average salary of an architect. I could not afford to live in Manhattan. I could not afford to live in my apartment. It does not take a forensic accountant to figure out a parent's lifestyle. Our kids, and actually psychologists like Lisa D'Amour, who I interviewed for this book, are finding in their clients this burden on kids who feel like they have to replicate their childhoods. And what that does is it really narrows the kind of jobs they can pursue, often in finance or tech. It narrows the places they think they should live. So I think one of the things that we need to do as parents when we talk about values with our kids is to talk about what it is we actually do value. Is it the big house, or is it being close to family? Is that the value? And your family happens to live, in your community. So I think it is important for us as parents to have these conversations when our kids are raising them and really have them directly. And they could be a little uncomfortable, but I think that it is really important for parents to be clear, not just in modeling, but in our words, what it is we value, and by our calendar, what it is we value.
Absolutely. My daughter attended local university here. Colors are red and white. You probably know which one I mean. And she was overwhelmed by the idea that there were only three options for her future. It was like law, medicine, or here in Silicon Valley, venture capitalism. And it took 4 years of really talking with her about, no, that's not what your future needs to be. She was convinced that she could never make a living in public health. She is, but we've got to show our kids that there's lots of options, right?
Exactly. That there, and you not only show our kids that there are lots of options, but ever since I learned about values and money and how they impact well-being, I have made a point to introduce my kids to people who I believe are living a successful life, and it has nothing to do with money. So when my kids talk about they need to go to this college or that college, I say, do you know who one of my most successful friends are? And they know her. And I say, she went to a college in Ohio, a small school that I cannot pronounce. It begins with an M. And she went on to have not only an incredibly successful career as a senior producer at 60 Minutes, but she also lived a life that I believe is successful, meaning that she had a strong marriage. She was an integral part of her neighborhood. She had a deep relationship with her family and her friends and her colleagues. She gave back to her community. She was very involved with historic preservation, and helping low-income families in her community. So what I try to do is explicitly talk to my kids about what I think is a successful life. And I point to this friend, Katie.
That's really good advice. And also, Jenny, I'm sure you'll agree that we love Frank Bruni's book, Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be. He's
Yes.
appeared twice in this program. It's really important for kids to understand that. It's
Oh,
what they put into it, not necessarily what they get out of it.
I was asked, I was speaking at a very large public school on the North Shore of Chicago, and a senior raised his hand and he said to me, "Do you think your college?" I went undergraduate to Harvard back when it was an 18% acceptance rate, not the 3% that it is today. He said, "Do you think your college, that Harvard prepared you for your achievements and success?" And I said, "I want to be really careful with how I answer this.
Mhm.
No, no, Harvard didn't prepare me. Harvard didn't wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to meet my deadlines. Harvard didn't work for 4 years traveling the country, doing independent research and meeting with experts and putting in the work and making my relationships strong with my kids and my friendships, my real social network." I said, "Bet on yourself, invest in yourself, not in a brand name. That brand name may open a door depending on where you want to work." But I will say this, and I said this in another talk, at 60 Minutes, my brand name worked against me. I had to prove myself that I was not a privileged person, because many of the people that I worked with back when I worked there didn't graduate college. And they went to colleges that nobody talked about where they went to college. So if anything, I feel like Harvard worked against me in my chosen profession. This is not, this is not to say that Harvard gave me great friendships. That's what they gave me. I know I could have gotten that education at 200 colleges. And I say that to my kids.
I hope that young man listened to you, Jenny, because I think that was an awesome answer.
The
So,
parents clapped. And I just said it to him, like, just invest in you.
yeah,
You are what's going to be the success. It's
yeah,
you.
absolutely. So we understand that you have literally been traveling across the country, talking multiple times a day to all kinds of people. What in your audiences has surprised you the most?
I would say I wrote this book for myself, a tired mother. I wanted it to be the kind of book that I could pick up at the end of the night after a very long day of working and being with my kids, and open this book and have it be readable and enjoyable and not have to work too hard. So I pictured, as I was writing it, the tired mother like me. What has shocked me is how many dads have picked up this book. And when this book first, actually it was Scott Galloway, who is a professor at NYU, and he has couple of popular podcasts, Pivot and Professor G. And he got an early galley of my book, and he popped it on his Twitter feed and his Instagram feed. And his followers, who are predominantly men, broke my Amazon page for 48 hours. They were buying the book because he said it's a must read. And when I go to these talks, I'm amazed is too strong a word, and it's not fair for dads, but I'm so delighted by how many fathers are deeply engaged with this book. And I've been invited to over 24 corporate events, more than half of them by dads. So this book is resonating with dads, and that's been a delight.
And Jenny, it's not just they're worried about their children mattering. It's more than that for the dads, isn't it?
It is. I mean, something that I found extraordinarily important, and surprising in the research, was that the number one intervention for any child in distress is to make sure their primary caregivers, their mother, their father, that their well-being and their support system is intact, because a child's resilience rests fundamentally on the resilience of the adults in their lives. And too many parents today, mothers and fathers, spend hours at work feeling disengaged, feeling like they don't matter, that they could be easily laid off and replaced, sometimes feeling like cogs in a wheel, not feeling appreciated. So what happens when you are working 8, 10, 12 hours a day in a place that doesn't make you feel like you matter? How can you come home and show up and be the first responder that you want to be for your kids? It is very hard. So what the research finds for parents is that our resilience rests fundamentally on the depth and support of our relationships. So what I would say to moms and dads who are out there listening, and I have done this myself after reading all of the research, is to invest in your relationships outside of the home for the betterment of the people in them. So what does it look like to invest in your relationships? Researchers studied busy parents in the Mayo Clinic, mothers who were physicians and physicians assistants and nurse practitioners who were also parents. And they looked at what kind of relationship made them feel like they mattered, made them feel valued, gave them the support. And what they found was they could build these relationships in as little as 1 hour a week, 1 hour of intentional time with people that you can be vulnerable to and that you allow to be vulnerable with you. And it is the same thing that we want for our kids. We want to feel seen and heard and validated and supported, just like we want to be that for our kids. So just to close this, I am not saying as parents to put your oxygen mask on first. I am saying have 1 or 2 or 3 people, friends in your life who know you deeply, who know when you're struggling, who sense when you are gasping for air, and who will reach over and put the oxygen mask on for you. It is not that the parents I met in these communities didn't have friends. It's that they often didn't have the time or the emotional bandwidth to invest in those friends so that they could be sources of support for one another. So if there's anything you take from this talk, it is to prioritize your own well-being and support system so that you could be that strong, sturdy support that your child needs.
Thank you. Really beautifully said, Jenny, and so, so true. And we can see in the chat people really agreeing with you. So we're going to open it to questions from the audience in 1 minute, but I just wanted to ask you one question from the advice that you give parents in your book. I love this. You say, one of the ways that we can explicitly express to our children that they matter to us is by getting a PhD in them. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, so Rick Weisbord, who's at Making Caring Common in Massachusetts, gave me a piece of advice. He said, a child's sense of self, and I would say an adult sense of self, becomes stronger, less by being praised than by being known. So what does it mean to know our kids? Like Charlene said, it's getting a PhD in them. It's seeing what it is uniquely about them that makes them tick. What are their strengths? What are they good at? And I found as a parent, honestly, I struggled with finding what my kids' strengths are. They are so much a part of who they are that it was hard for me to kind of separate them. And so a couple of tips I have for parents in the book is, one thing that I did with my family is we took the VIA survey, VIA survey. It stands for Values in Action. And it's a free online survey that is scientifically validated. It was developed by 2 of the leading researchers, the grandfathers of positive psychology, Marty Seligman and Christopher Peterson. And it's a short quiz. There's an adult version, and then there's a version for young people and kids. And we did it. And I'll give you just a little example. So my daughter took it, and she was in 7th grade at the time. And, there was drama at the lunchroom table. So she'd come home from school complaining about the drama at the lunchroom table. And I said, okay, which of your strengths could you use to overcome that obstacle at lunchtime? And she looked at it and she said, humor. I could use humor. I could be sarcastic. When somebody starts to stir up trouble, I can pop it with a sarcastic joke. And that's just a small example. But a couple of other quick little tips for getting to know your kids is to listen to the adults in their lives. Teachers are really good at seeing and identifying our kids' strengths. So what I've taken to doing is annotating their report cards. So when a teacher talks about the strength, William is always the first one to help a friend when they're struggling with a math problem. I'll highlight it and I'll say, I see this too. You do the same thing with your siblings. You're so kind. And then one last thing that we do as a family tradition is along these lines is when it's a birthday, we go around the table and we say one thing we love about the birthday boy or girl. And it's never, that you got an A in AP Calculus. It's always that you are so generous in helping your siblings when they're needing help, with their homework, or you're so loving and kind with your grandparents. So it's things that are inherent about them, pointing them out, letting them see their value outside of the system, outside of the achievement culture, their value for who they are deep at their core.
So important. We've talked for many years about parents mattering. And it's wonderful to hear you say, obviously, that kids matter. This is why we do this work, Jenny, is we're supporting children through families, caregivers, and educators. And you've given it a beautiful voice. Okay, audience, we've got lots of great questions. Let's have at it. Good question. Let's start here. What role do schools play in mattering?
Right. So in the back of my book, I have a section that's called Take Action. And I say that all stakeholders, parents, schools, communities, higher education, need to come together really to push back against these toxic forces. For schools, they play a large role. And honestly, one of the first things that I would say schools need to do, which might surprise you, but for student mental health, is to make sure teachers matter. Make sure teachers feel like they matter, that they are valued by their administrators, that they are valued by the families, that they are valued by their students. So I make it a point in our home when I talk about, for example, my son was struggling with Spanish, and he went and he took a quiz and he did really well. And I said, why do you think you did well on that quiz? And he said, well, I studied a lot. And I said, yeah, you studied a lot, but you also went in a few times and you met with your Spanish teacher before school. So she sacrificed time with her family, time for prep, so that you could do better. So really instilling that sense of gratitude in our kids for their teachers, and as parents to express that gratitude as well. I think it's become to me, a very sad state of affairs where parents and administrators and teachers really are butting heads, and it does not have to be that way. And for schools, they have a responsibility to make families matter too, and students matter. Not just the high performers, not just the kids who get the trophies, but kids who have hidden talents, kids who are never celebrated. So I visited schools that literally on Fridays would have a hidden talent day. And if a child was too introverted and shy to stand up, they would have a classmate, their friend, stand up and interview them and talk about the child's hidden talent. Let them feel valued. I'll give you one last example. For schools to also make families feel like they're valued. During COVID, my daughter's school, I'll never forget this. They reached out the first week of COVID and they called every single family. And the school psychologist called my phone and asked me how my husband and I were doing and how each child was doing by name, and said, we are a community that wants to support each other. Is there anything you need? And boy, when I picked up the phone, I felt like I mattered. And that has solidified my relationship with that school in a time when they were, running without a script. They chose to lead with mattering. And I'm forever grateful.
That's a wonderful story, Jenny. What motivates me is about 10 years ago, an HR director in a school district said to me, Charlene, your program would be the first one cut because you don't directly impact students. And I said, I know about 20,000 parents who would disagree with you, right? The same goes for educators. As a former teacher, I raised my children to believe that that classroom environment was their responsibility as much as it was the teachers. And they believe that to this day. But so those are good ways, parents, to encourage your kids to make a difference at school, and conversely, for schools to do the same for families, right? Okay, we have lots of questions. Let's keep going here. Here's a good question. How do I model and convey to my kids that they matter? What are some practical ways to emphasize intrinsic values?
Okay, so I'll give a big picture idea, and then we could talk about nitty-gritty ideas. So, well, first let me start with this. Tina Payne Bryson, who's a psychoanalyst in California, gave me 4 questions that for parents to really take like a values check and see the kind of signals that we are sending our kids, even sometimes inadvertently. So she offers these 4 questions for reflection. The first thing is, look at your child's calendar. How do they spend their time outside of school? The second question is, take a look at how you spend your money as it relates to your kids. How many of those dollars is spent towards goal, oriented things like coaching and tutoring? Take a look at what you ask your kids about when they walk in the door. And the last thing is, what do you argue with your kids about? Those 4 questions will tell you a lot about the signal you are sending about what really matters to you. And I will say, another sort of mindset that Sonia Luthar, who is, was until she passed away, one of the world's leading researchers, she talked about how home needed to be a haven from the pressure. That our kids, different than when we were growing up, our kids are getting the pressure to succeed from everywhere, from their classmates, parents, from social media and the environment. Home needs to be a place for our kids to recover from those messages, a place where our kids' sense of self, their value, their worth is never in question. It does not mean that parents don't have standards. It doesn't mean that parents, don't hold kids accountable. But there is a way of injecting what I call in the book healthy fuel, which is a healthy motivating fuel, versus dirty fuel, which is the kind of fuel that a tired parent might employ when they are really tired and they just want their kid to study for the Spanish quiz. And that is a lot of criticism or social comparison. So anyway.
So here's a couple questions. They're long, but I'm going to try to summarize them because I do think they're interesting. Parent asks, thank you for saying stop blaming the parents. I do think this change has to come on a systems level. I cannot fathom how stressful this is for kids. Would love your thoughts. It just that this person says, I just wish there was time in school for kids to enjoy and feel connected in spite of the pressure.
Yes. So I will say, what researchers find when teachers and parents have an acrimonious relationship, that it hits our kids the way an ugly divorce does. It makes them feel like they have to pick sides.
Yeah.
So for our children's benefit, when we have an issue with the school or we have an issue with a particular teacher, to work that issue out away from our kids' ears. Work that out, protect your child's relationship with their teacher, because after parents, teachers are an extraordinary source of mattering for our kids. We want them to feel like they matter to their teachers. When they matter to their teachers, they want to perform. They want to show up in the classroom in positive ways. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
Close enough, Jenny. So I'm going to ask a question, preface this, parents, with, as Jenny said, we are not anti-performance. We are not anti-achievement. I believe in it. My kids both went to nice universities. I like AP classes. They liked AP classes, but we want healthy kids. We want healthy kids, and that has to trump everything else, right? So here's a question. Thank you, Jennifer. Since you are a high achiever yourself, how do you accept or handle your own children not achieving what you have done? How do you communicate that message to them when you want them to be successful as a person, knowing they may not get to your level of success? I don't think that's fair to your kids, but let's let's just put the question on the table.
So again, what I consider success in our family and the way we define it as a family is success to me is finding our strengths and finding a way to use them to positively impact the world. That could be my strength is writing and communicating. So it's through a book, it's through my articles, it's through my work at 60 Minutes. For my kids, they have different strengths and they have so many strengths, and I can't wait to see what they're going to do. But I will tell you, I don't think any of them are going to write books. They might. My youngest has, we say to him, he's an unbelievable storyteller, and we hope he gets paid one day for all of his stories because he's a good storyteller. So the way I handle it in my home is that my measure of success is not making the New York Times bestseller list. And actually, it's funny because I talked about this explicitly with my kids when my book was coming out.
You did.
I said to them, really good books come out and they don't make the New York Times bestseller list. And that to me is not the metric of success. The metric of success for me is when mattering becomes a household word that people use and that they can use to better their lives and their children's lives. That to me is success. And so I feel like I have hit it. I happened to make the New York Times bestseller list. They were with me when I got it. I was happy. It's a fleeting happiness. It's a great momentary blip, but that does not define me. My achievements do not define me. And I am very strategic and pointed and directed in how I talk about it.
That sounds really practical and smart of you because it is tricky to negotiate. Here's one. Parent says, it's really hard to move away from grades alone when the colleges and schools are putting so much emphasis on them. Another parent is asking about AP classes and weighted GPAs. Just give us a minute, Jenny, with your thoughts on those parameters.
So I have a senior. He is in his room right now writing his college essays. We are talking about the college process in a very deliberate way in my house. I wrote a chapter and I wrote a section in the chapter. It's chapter 5, Confronting Grind Culture. I write a section called Reject the Premise. And it is rejecting the premise that where you go to college, that the path to a good life is found through a good college. It's just patently false. I have gone to a good college, and I will tell you, there are people I went to school with whose lives did not turn out the way they wanted. And there are people who have gone to other schools that are not even on the map, and their lives have turned out even better than they expected. And there is research to back up that where you go to college does not determine midlife happiness, career success, or financial success. And I lay it all out in that chapter, in that section. And what I did was have my son. So first of all, we did not talk about college. There was a rule in my house that we would talk about it the spring of junior year. And we abided by that rule. We didn't look at colleges. I don't think there's no one way of doing it. This is what worked in my house. And my house was, we weren't going to really talk about it until the spring of junior year. And then we talked about, I had my son read that section that talked about, it's not where you go, but how you go to college that is actually linked with career success, financial success, and midlife well-being. And how you go to college. There actually, and I outline them in the book, there are 6 factors that researchers have found over it is the largest study ever done of colleges, 30,000 students. They looked at, is it the prestige of a college that matters? Is it the size of the college, public or private? None of those factors mattered. They had a negligible effect. Now, the researchers found that for students of color, there was a link between a college's rank, and a small link, but still a link, and their career and financial success. And the researchers can't decide between 2 reasons. Is it because these kids who were often first gen Was it that they were now given access and connections that they wouldn't have had otherwise? Or was it that these colleges that are higher ranked often have full rides for students? And so was it that they weren't saddled with debt, or was it that they got the networking effect? They don't know, but the effect was also small. So just quickly, what the researchers found, I get into it more fully in the chapter, but they found, did the college student have a connection with a professor who knew their name and invested in their well-being, who knew them beyond being a student? Were they given an opportunity to take what they were learning and apply it into a multi-semester project? Were they involved in extracurricular activities? Did they have close connections on that campus? In other words, put simply, did the students that did the best over the course of the next 20 to 30 years felt like they mattered on their college campus? They felt valued by their professors and by their peers, and they were given an opportunity to add value back to that campus. And that high level of mattering carried them through. They learned how to matter. So the way we talk about it in my family is, how are you going to go to college? What are you going to do? How
That's,
are you going to get involved?
yeah, did you hear that, parents? Not where, she's saying how. That's a really big difference. So Jenny, I want to give you a few minutes, or well, a minute for formal last words. But one thing that I really loved about this book, and there's a question here about what is in here. Is it just research? No, her book is filled full of practical advice, and the end of it even has resources for where to go, what to read, what to look at, questions to think about. It is profoundly a resource, not just, I shouldn't say just, but it's not just a book. It's more than that. It's truly a resource. So everybody, we hope that you do pick up a copy. The questions have been wonderful. I wish we could answer them all, but Jenny, I would love to just give you 30 seconds for some final thoughts.
Well, I would first love to say, if there were questions that you had, I am, follow me on Instagram and send me a DM, and I'm trying to address questions in reels. So I won't use your name, but I may use your question and address it for my audience. So it's at Jennifer Wallace. If your question wasn't answered tonight. Final reflection is something that Mark Brackett, who's at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, told me. He said, think about your children 10 to 20 years from now. What is the story you want them to tell about their childhood and about you as a parent? And then ask yourself if you're helping your kids to tell that story. So that's something that when I need it, I pull back and I think about the big picture, and it centers me, it grounds me.
All right. That is incredible. As a new grandmother with kids in their 30s, that's something I think about every day. So Jenny, that is really beautiful advice. People keep asking about the name of your book. The name of the book is Never Enough: When Achievement Culture Becomes Toxic and What We Can Do About It. And Jennifer truly does have advice for what we can do about it. Parents, it's well worth the read. Jennifer, thank you for a really brilliant conversation tonight. And thank you everybody who is with us and all these wonderful, amazing questions. We'll make sure to send them her way, and you'll have reels for weeks and weeks. So Jennifer Wallace, thank you again for your generosity and being here tonight. And for everybody, thank you. We hope that we've given you some peace of mind and some breathing space as a parent, as an educator, whatever your role. So take care, everybody. Good night, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.